one of the things that I try to do as House Majority Whip is to make sure that every single piece of legislation that comes before the leadership for consideration, that there are certain elements that I look for to try and make sure is either there or we put it in. If you were to look at the recently passed recovery package, or stimulus bill as some people called it, now that legislation is proposed to stabilize communities. And people talk about that legislation as being our modern response to our economic crises, much like the 1930s response to the 1929 stock market crash. Well, if you really look at what we did following 1929, I'm not too sure that it would qualify, the results would qualify for a passing grade by the Drum Major Institute. Because if you look at the communities that were really affected by the legislation, the poor communities all over our country got left behind. And so I worked very hard to make sure that we did not have a 21st century New Deal, which in my opinion was a raw deal for many of the communities I represent. And so I was insisting that we do that governor's workaround, for instance, in these governors who are coming from a lot of southern states saying, we don't need this money, this is a wasteful spending, while taking all the money that was going for sort of infrastructure projects that they favor. But the education stuff, the first responder stuff, leaving that on the table. What did we do? We made sure that we put language in to target these communities. And there's a part of this bill that few people ever focus on, and I try to get communities all around to focus on. We've got in this bill on the tax side and the expenditure side. We say that if in the last 30 years, through the last 3 censuses, we've found 20% or more of the population living below the poverty level, then 10% of this money must be targeted to those communities. And that's why we did that. We also said that if you, for instance, are spending money on infrastructure or handing out contracts and subcontracts, we put money in this bill to assist minority businesses, not just with getting the contract, but helping them qualify for the expenditures. We're saying that here in this bill, $10 million is here for you not to just help with their bonding problems, but to help train them so that they can get the bond and can participate, so that not just big businesses would be the only ones to participate. So I do that sort of thing with every single piece of legislation. In addition to that, I always look for what I call a HBCU component, that is historical black colleges and universities. I want to make sure, knowing a little bit about what may have incentivized the naming of this institute. I suspect it had to do with Martin Luther King Jr.'s drum major for justice, the place, the thing that he wanted to be, absolutely, be remembered for. Well, having been one of those people that marched with King many times, stood under the speech. In fact, I was with him that weekend before he had his first arrest at Albany. We were there on Morehouse campus together, along with John Lewis and Marion Barry here in Washington, Julian Bond. We were there together. Now, I went on back to South Carolina which is a little bit outside of the media market. And those guys who stayed around Atlanta, people heard about them a lot, never heard anything else about me. But that's all right.
Yeah.
But the point I'm making here is that when I look at legislation, I think about what we were doing back then. I think about this whole issue of justice for all communities, whether or not legislation is having an even application. And so I look to see, well, if the big universities are getting X number of dollars, how can we make sure that historically black colleges and universities where most the African American middle class get educated, why or aren't we doing what we ought to be doing for them? So I always look at the legislation to make sure that there's some component there, and I had pretty good success in getting my side to focus on that. In fact, it was interesting when we were putting the recovery package together to sit down with Charlie Rangel.
Yeah.
And when I started talking about money, Charlie says, well, why don't we do the same thing on the tax side? And so there's some interesting things in this legislation. As we go around meeting with people, we get them to focus on this. So I try to do that with almost every piece of legislation that comes before us.